Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying, I should say, for the second half of this evening's entertainment. So tonight we're going to talk about economy to ecosystem, grasping complexity and understanding relationships. So really, these series of talks that I've been doing sort of started around universal basic income, then broadened out into currency design in general. So what we're doing with all these blockchains, and this blockchain of distributed technology, is designing different currencies, different ways of trading value. And that really comes down to governance design that's tied in fairly closely. So as soon as you start designing currencies for communities to trade value with each other, you have to start thinking about how those communities can change the rules, right? If you look at a currency as a protocol for exchanging value, how do you change the rules of that protocol, right? How does a society make decisions about allocating resources to worthwhile endeavors, right? These are all governance questions, and there's a very direct correlation between economic decision making and political decision making, and basically that's why these are very difficult to separate. So how we arrived here today is that last month I gave a talk on spiral dynamics and currency design, right? So that looked at, if we're going to design currencies, that how can we allow for the evolution of culture, right? So how can we allow the fact that cultural standards and norms as they are today may not hold tomorrow? And there are a lot of assumptions inherent in the design of our currencies, no matter how we shape them, and what happens when beliefs and values in society changes. How can we design to incorporate that and allow for that? So there's a link to last month's talk. Today we're going to take step one, basically, in how we design governance, right? And really, there's just one key takeaway message, and that is to stop thinking of networks and communities trading currencies and economies as disparate, separate objects, and start looking at the relationships between all things. That's really the one key takeaway message of today. So if you get nothing else, that's really what we're going to. However, with that one key takeaway, we still have a few things we're going to go through. So here's a bit of a roadmap of today. We're going to confirm the purpose of governance design for distributed systems. So I'll warn you, there's some of my own inherent idealism in there, and I'm quite happy to be challenged on that. We're going to explore the limitations of object-oriented thinking, discuss some examples of fuzzy boundaries, contrast complicated versus complex systems, explore some feedback loops in our current monetary system, explore some feedback loops in our current political systems and institutions, and discuss. So I'm trying to make sure that we can get some key takeaways from today as a group. So not just have me rant non-stop at everybody, but actually get a little bit of a discussion going. Is there an optimal balance between authoritarianism and libertarianism, right? Is there an optimal balance between one guy at the top saying this is what we're all going to do, and everyone at the bottom just being free to do whatever they like? And discuss how could feedback loops be designed to improve the balance between central authority and distributed liberty over time. So that's really the goals of today. So what is the purpose of governance design for distributed systems? So first of all, we have a limitation, or at least a precondition that we're assuming, which is that all blockchain-based systems, which we're talking about designing governance around or for, all blockchain systems have voluntary participation, right? We're assuming we're not going to allow for any coercion or military edict to, download Bitcoin 2.0 or else. We're going to assume that people will voluntarily have to adopt any of these new currencies and governance systems that we're designing. Second is that all blockchains are fundamentally a shared resource. They're a commons, right? Just like air is a commons, water is a commons, although now it can be owned and bottled and sold in shops. And ethics is another form of commons. So for me personally, I only want to involve myself in designing ethical governance systems. And when I say ethics, I mean defending the welfare of conscious beings. Because at a fundamental level, what is ethics if defending the welfare of conscious beings? If there was a universe with no consciousness in it whatsoever, then we'd just be talking about inanimate rocks flying around in space, crashing into each other. There is no mention of good or evil in that whatsoever. There's no place for it. It's only once there is a kitten in the mix and one of these rocks hits a kitten, you can start to talk about good or bad. If there's another conscious creature that threw the rock into the kitten, then you really start looking at ethics and moral implications of action, right? So to me, fundamentally, ethics only makes sense when it is around defending the welfare of conscious beings. And finally, to me, that means what we're trying to maximize or optimize when we're creating governance design for our currencies. So we're trying to maximize the greatest common good, right? We're trying to defend the welfare of conscious beings. We're trying to maximize the greatest common good. Now that is much, much easier said than done, right? I don't always know the best decision for myself to make, even if I'm acting in a 100% self-interested way. I cannot always determine what that one best action is, right? Even if there's trade-offs between, I feel good eating ice cream now, but eating that salad might be better 20 years down the track. Ooh, it's a tough one, right? There's tough choices. So just because we have that as a goal doesn't mean it's easy to achieve. All right. So let's explore some of the limitations of object-oriented thinking. So our society at the moment is very heavily involved in scientific thinking and the idea that you can take anything, pull it apart into its component pieces and analyze each piece independently. Of course, there are some limitations to that form of logic. So the object-oriented thinking, it sort of it isolates and atomizes everything. Of course, it misses a lot of the nuance and the complexity that occur in groups, right? You can't understand a bee colony by studying a single bee, right? There's a role that a single bee plays that's part of the overall whole. Similarly, right? You might be able to understand price, which is a simple number, and anything can have a price and anything can have a cost. However, value is a much, much harder thing to define because essentially value is a relationship, right? Like we don't even have to discuss the limitations of only seeing objects in terms of their value to you, but value is a relationship between the person who has a need of something and the object. And then there's the concept of, does a bird or a tree have value in and of itself, regardless of any human being having a particular utility for that thing, right? Is it valuable that there are stars in the night sky that none of us can mine for diamonds. Then, right, there's the concept of a body as a separate object, when in fact, your body is an ecosystem, right? More than half the cells in my body are of non-human origin, and I am alive because of millions and millions of relationships between different bacteria and enzymes within my body that I couldn't even come close to consciously understanding or describing, let alone regulating in any sensible way. All I know is that I can trust it. My body is anti-fragile. And what that means is that even if I have a terrible diet for 20 years and there's some imbalances created, somehow my body is able to regulate it, so when I have that bounty bar, it still manages to turn it into a human being somehow, right? And we'll get to more of that in the fuzzy boundaries idea. So then there's your role, right? Who here is a son or a daughter, right? Who here is a parent, all right? These are roles, but actually more than that, these are relationships. Right? You cannot be a son or a daughter without there being a parent on the other side of that. As a matter of fact, I cannot even be short or tall without there being other people in relation to which I am short or tall. So all these different attributes that you might describe yourself by, they're actually descriptions of relationships of a different form altogether as well. And then, there's your identity. What do you identify yourself as? Now that's a fairly complex subject as well. And really it tends to come, what we identify ourselves as, it's like, well, hi, I'm Anouk. Actually tends to be an attribute. As, very simply, it's just one piece that we put forth, although the whole of our identity tends to be tied up in relationships all around us, right? And in some ways, you could say that we can never know ourselves except in relation to the world around us, in relationship to the people that matter to us and to the activities and the world that we relate to on a daily basis. So, that's the big sort of shift, right? Let's go from individual objects randomly bouncing into each other and reacting to relationships, right, that evolve and shift over time and have qualities, because each of us can be different people in relationship to different people. I know I have a different personality around my direct family than I do around my colleagues or around strangers. There's different aspects of me that shine forth in each of those conditions. But more than that, fuzzy boundaries start to come into play. So we've all heard of a coastline, right? If you look top down, you can see it clear. That's where the land ends and that's where the water begins. But if you zoom in on that, if you're actually on the beach, it's really more of a gradient, isn't it? It's actually that the sand slopes down and there's water at a certain level. And when there's waves, it moves up and it moves down, and it's changing constantly. And really what you're looking at is a gradient there. Another oversimplification might be, what's the temperature today? Right? If you ever noticed, especially on cold days, it's very noticeable that the air about 1 centimeter above the ground is a lot colder than it is even at head height, right? That's a temperature gradient that you're getting. And the same happens on hot days when the sun's reflecting off the asphalt, right? There's a different temperature at different levels. Right, buyer or seller, who here is a buyer? Who here is a seller? Who here is all of these some of the time and can't be identified as a single one of these because the boundaries, right? Whenever I've gone and bought some food, I've also sold some Australian dollars or whatever other currency in the country I happen to be in at the time. And another one I would say is wealth and power, right? Wealth and power have a complex relationship, but they're very much not mutually exclusive. They have differences of meaning in our language, but there's also so much overlap between them, right? You can be wealthy in connections and relationships that give you, in effect, power to influence others and influence decisions and all that sort of thing. So can anyone here think of any other boundaries, right, that might be fuzzy when you look at it a bit more closely? So anything where you go, well, it's this or that. Actually, it's more of a gradient. It's more of a shift. Relationships. Exactly. Well, they're the bit that forms in the middle, isn't it? Right? Relationships. When do you go from a friend to a lover? When do you go from an acquaintance to a friend? That's all very hazy and non-specific, these things. So it's a good one. The one I mentioned before is, when does an apple cease to be an apple and when does it become my body? When I eat it, right? Can I just introduce a middle state of, well, it's no longer an apple, it's been so deconstructed that it's just nutrients and acids and whatever else happens in my system? Well, I'm still left with, the apple of which I've taken one bite. Half of it's broken down, half of it hasn't. Like, there's just more distinctions with a fuzzy gradient in between them. Anyone else have any other boundaries that are more fuzzy?
Right and wrong.
Beautiful. Right and wrong. Right? That's a very much a false dichotomy, right? There's so many perspectives on every action. It's beautiful. Sorry?
Fact and truth.
Fact and truth. Yep. They're almost synonymous in meaning, but not quite. Can you have an untrue fact? What's it? Alternative facts, I believe, was the exactly, right? And in terms of, untruth as well, and relative truth, and all those fuzzy edges there. All right. So, have people here heard of the concepts of complicated and complex systems before? Nope. So, basically the difference, so this is one of the keys of systems thinking. It's starting to look at complex systems instead of complicated systems. So complex systems describe systems which have feedback loops where, me and my relationship to the world, as I change the world changes me, right? There are feedback loops going on constantly. So if you're looking at complicated systems, you're generally very good for mechanical systems with interchangeable parts that interact with each other. If you're looking at complex systems, you're looking more at ecosystems that are anti-fragile, meaning that, if you have a forest, for instance, and you take out an insect species, then all the other species in the forest tend to rebalance and adjust, and different niches are filled and diets are altered, and a new equilibrium is formed, right? It restores the balance. It's got feedback loops in terms of births and deaths of populations to rebalance out. Of course, what we're finding in our natural ecosystems, and this is a metaphor I may not want to drag too far, but what we're finding in our natural ecosystems is that you can only take out so many species. You can only cut down so much of the rainforest until even that anti-fragility, that ability to adapt to different situations, starts to become strained. And all of a sudden, the species that are left are needed to perform too many functions for too many different relationships that they're in. So all of a sudden, it turns into a very fragile system, which is why there are lots of people very afraid of losing bumblebees, for instance, now. Because, oh no, you take out the bumblebees and all of a sudden none of the flowers will get pollinated because all of the other insect species have drastically fallen over the last so many years, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, we're talking...
The example that you just gave, might it be better to use the word robust than anti-fragile? Because I think anti-fragile is supposed to refer to something actually getting stronger with perturbation rather than just resisting perturbation.
It's actually a pretty good comment in terms of that use of language. The term anti-fragile is used to describe it a lot, but I agree. Robust, regenerative, adaptive. Adaptive, I think, is a good phrase for it, right? So when you alter any of the components in a complex system, the other components will automatically adapt to the changed conditions, right? And that's how these feedback loops work. Of course, if you're looking at a mechanical system like a watch and you take out any one of the cogs, no matter how small, the other rest of the mechanism just becomes useless. So yes, anti-fragile, adaptive, I think is a good word there. So let's explore some feedback loops in our current money system, right? So it's not an exhaustive list because you can look into, all sorts of little details and the little eddies of our system in different places. But the first and most obvious feedback loop is interest. Right? So anytime there is a pile of money sitting somewhere and earning interest, it will grow and grow and grow over time. Simultaneously, at the other end of the scale, anytime the poorest owe money to other people, right, that interest will add up and add up and add up over time. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Interest very much has a role to play in that feedback system. And remembering that our current, bank-issued money is debt issued at interest, that fundamentally means that every dollar is earning interest for one person and is owed to a bank by another. Taxation, similarly, it creates feedback loops, more so in some countries than in others. Where taxation for large corporates tends to be optional because it's they have access to moving jurisdictions to tax-friendly locations, whereas for individuals who are, resorting to trading their time for dollars, that's a far more difficult prospect to actually offset those earnings into another jurisdiction. So that's another one of those feedback systems, as well as the fact that taxation is, again, used to pay the interest on the money that's borrowed. So it's part of the same feedback system. And we've got rent seeking, right? So once you own your first 5 houses, you can quite easily use the equity and the revenue being generated from those to leverage yourself into another house and another house. And then, in the words of Robert Kiyosaki, 5 houses, then swap over for a hotel, right? The lesson from Monopoly. So that sort of is a very self-fulfilling, right? And then opportunity is another one. And it's not really inherent just in our money system. It's actually inherent, it's far more fundamental, right? There is a somewhat of a normal distribution curve, and there is, extreme failure on one end and extreme success on the other, and then most of us are sitting somewhere in the stable middle surviving, but, you have a bad night's sleep and you have a bad first important meeting for that job interview or that potential client or that potential partnership, and that goes badly, and then you lose another night's sleep worrying about that, and you get a little bit depressed and you isolate yourself from people, and then 2 weeks down the track you lose your job and you can't pay your rent, or you get kicked out and you end up on the street and you're fallen down into a hole that's very difficult to climb out of. Right? It's sort of there's a snowballing effect that's not the fault of any of the government or the banks or the money system or any of that. It's part of human nature and part of culture and part of existing. It's almost impossible to do anything about that downward spiral. It's also equally difficult to do something about the opposite end of that, where you have a good night's sleep, you make a good first impression on a potential client or job interview, and you get that job and you get that client, and you get you get further opportunities that are issued there because they introduce you to more people and more opportunities, and you land that big deal and you get to meet, I don't know, some prime minister who puts you in just the right spot, and then all of a sudden your phone's ringing off the hook, and can you help save the world, be highly paid positions on the UN or whatever your opportunities might be. All of a sudden, everyone's knocking on your door, hoping to give you opportunities to do whatever it is you want to do, including more money. And that is a very important feedback loop. I don't know a better word than opportunity for now. But it's something that also needs to be accounted for in the fact that there is not really anything you can do about that, because that's the way life works. You can put safety nets in place to prevent people from falling too far down, but especially if we're looking at the way networks distribute success, right? Every time you get a YouTube, you get 4 million people just hoping, just wishing for their fifth like, and you get one Justin Bieber on, I don't know, $200 million or something, and like more success than he at his relatively young age is able to cope with. Just imagine what kind of stresses that puts on a young, and responsibilities that puts on a young human being, right? Okay. That's supposed to be feedback loops in our current political system. My apologies. So we have, corporate and political revolving doors, people that have senior positions in corporate offices having an easy entry into politics and then finishing up with politics and going back into corporates and vice versa. America is really the poster child for this particular philosophy, but we tend to respect people who have succeeded in one of these arenas highly in the other, which of course creates a feedback loop around, where donations come from and where lobbyists come from and whose interests political actions tend to influence. We have feedback loops in hiring decisions where people tend to hire people with similar political views, right, in our political circles as well as in corporate circles, right? So you have that everywhere, where people hire people who are like them far more than they will hire people who will challenge them. And that will create feedback loops and subcultures. But first, corruption, right? So I think our current political system is actually one of the most resistant to corruption there is. But over hundreds and hundreds of years, little by little, people have found, ways of allowing decisions to be made that subtly influence their own positions, right? And if you do get to choose whether or not taxes should be paid on, let's say, owning hotels or owning houses, and you happen to own hotels or houses, right? Why wouldn't you put the tax cuts where your money is? Or vice versa, why wouldn't you put the tax cuts where your donor's money is? This is natural. Over time, right, because there are a lot of checks and balances on the use and abuse of power in the systems we have, it takes a long time for these things to get to the point where they are today, where I mean, is there anyone in this room who couldn't point to evidence of corruption in our current political system? Right? No one? Okay, I think, right, the corruption exists. And, nepotism exists, and favoritism, and, separation of classes above the law and below the law, right? It exists. And it's very difficult to do anything about. I'm not pretending these are easy problems to address. I'm saying that there are feedback loops that get started over a long period of time and then escalate as time progresses. Because once you have more and more power concentrated in fewer hands, the temptation to corruption becomes higher and higher and higher. And we can only rely on infallible people for so long. And finally, there's the bit about subcultures, which again is something that's far more fundamental. It's just that like attracts like. We like people who are like us. And in different areas, right, you have a different subculture of people within the blockchain center than you do of people in the police force, than you do in people in political offices, than you do with people in universities. Each of these areas have their own particular subculture. And, if you remember your childhood, right, we are all conditioned very much to behave in the manner that is expected of us. That's fundamentally human trait, right? Our parents show us the way to be, and if we behave that way, then we are good little boys and girls, and if we don't behave that way, we are bad little boys and girls. And there's an incredible anxiety deep within us, not just of death, but of excommunication, right? Of not being accepted by the people we relate to. And this means that the subculture level, right, the people that you mingle with have a lot of influence on you as you do on them. And these tend to reinforce themselves, right? This is why hiring decisions tend to end up hiring the same people over and over and over again. Which is also why people can start to generalize of, well, all lawyers are like this and all police officers are like this. And they're often not true, because as individuals we're different. But as we get together into these subcultures, into these cliques and groups, we tend to conform and we tend to gravitate towards subcultures that are already like us to begin with. So we self-select, first of all, into like-minded groups, and then slowly but surely we change our behavior consciously or subconsciously to match those around us. All right, so that's enough of me doing a one-sided rant. There's a lot of different decisions to make, a lot of different pros and cons to weigh up when you're looking at governance. So the reason, of course, that governance is important is, as we've seen with Bitcoin, right? When you have thousands of people running a computer program, none of whom know each other as anything other than an abstract number, you don't have a community that trusts each other. You just have strangers, and fundamentally encoded in the algorithm is this is trustless. Nobody trusts each other, therefore you don't actually have a community, right? The relationship you have is the most fleeting and incidental one, if at all. However, as a community as a whole, right, all the Bitcoin users still need to decide together if the protocol, if the algorithm of Bitcoin is to be shifted and changed over time, right? If it was to be decided that there should be 25 million Bitcoins, or that Bitcoin should be, the Bitcoin blockchain should allow for a larger block size, for instance, how does a group of people who've never met, who largely don't know each other's names, none of whom trust each other, definitely don't trust each other's motives, where the only thing they have in common is that the only incentive the protocol allows them to have is an economic one, how do they make decisions together? And as it's turned out, they really don't. There's lots of forks. There's about 80 forks of Bitcoin. The most well-known are Bitcoin, or Bitcoin Core, and Bitcoin Cash. Those are the most well-known forks where the community couldn't make a decision together. One of the most fundamental things we have to do as communities sharing a common platform is decide how that platform can evolve over time. How do we allocate resources? How do we negotiate with each other? How does this work? And here we're just going to look at one single piece of that and say, is there an optimal balance between central authority and distributed liberty? Right? So central authority is very good at making efficient decisions. Distributed liberty, right? Freedom of everyone and everyone being on an equal footing is very good at equity, right? If you all got a vote, then you're all equally to blame or equally innocent for the outcome. So just quick show of hands, who thinks there is an optimal balance between the two for a particular decision?
Probably depend on the decision that have to be made, if you could
Yep.
on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
But distributed liberty, by that do you mean, for example, voting?
For instance, voting is one mechanism that's quite popular. I personally have problems with voting on an economic basis, which is that voting is uneconomical on a large scale, right? If 3 of us are going to go choose a place to eat, then my vote matters, and it's something that I care about, and I can evaluate the options pretty quickly. That makes sense. If there are 28 million of us, and we have to choose between a number of people to represent our interests who won't tell us what decisions they'll make in future, who won't answer any question directly, then the amount of research I have to do to find out how these people have represented the people in the past, how they voted on particular issues that I may care about, and use that as a predictor to how they might vote on issues in the future, the amount of effort that takes compared to the chance of me influencing their being voted in or not out of 28 million votes, it just doesn't make sense, right? For everyone to make an informed decision in our elections, it is not a rational thing to do. So I'm a big believer in voting. I'm also a big believer in the limitations of voting alone, right? So there are different mechanisms that have been suggested, such as liquid democracy or delegative democracy, where people can choose a person they trust on specific issues. But yes, we're talking here about for a given political issue. So let's say immigration reform. Is there an optimal balance between a single authoritarian dictator deciding for all of us what immigration reform should be, and absolutely everyone having their say, right? Can we say there is one specific optimal balance? You've got one.
Sort of. Now, I don't know if I'll represent exactly what I watched perfectly in this quick clip, but I watched a TV show where they were talking about the Swiss political system.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it works over there is that you have your regular sort of democracy that we have here in Australia, but on top of it is this other layer where on particular hot topic issues you can actually get a certain amount of people together and it's forced to go to Parliament. So in some sense you can have your central authority there to be able to deal with the sort of more mundane things in politics. And if there's stuff that people really particularly care about, you can have this sort of distributed liberty around that decision making.
Plebiscite or something.
Yeah, it's sort of like a website, but it's a little. I mean, it's not going to cost $250 million. And I personally, what got me watching that was thinking about how certain blockchain mechanisms can be used to facilitate that kind of thing. We talk about how hard it can be and sort of gather and process stuff. It's a great way to sort of put that at ease and then even help people become more engaged with an understanding of what's going on as it happens as well. Is an interesting thing.
I was thinking I might hand this around if people are going to contribute, but I think we missed most of that. So the Swiss political system, being able to have voting on representatives, but also bring people to a certain number of people together on particular hot topic issues that then they can force those issues into Parliament. That's a very specific suggestion. You have...
Yeah, I think your question is a bit hard because if you've got someone who's at the central authority who's acting in an ethical way, then the central authority is an efficient way to get something through. But if that person isn't acting in an ethical way, then you need to have some form of distributed liberty. So it's a depends answer.
Exactly.
There's no fixed way. But I mean, one way I can put it, I spend a lot of time in open source.
Mm-hmm.
I like the way that the Linux kernel was developed. You had a central authority, but you also had distributed liberty. People that were in charge of certain specific aspects could dictate how that went. But when it got deployed into the kernel, it was up to the central authority. So it was a bit of a blend. Whether that would work in a currency format.
Exactly. Now, one of the reason I've chosen this topic today is one of the ways you can conceive of blockchain technology is that through time, right, we've only ever had two modes, right? We've had hierarchies as a way for communities to make decisions collectively. So one person tells the people under them, tell the people under them, and decisions get made. And markets, where everyone just buys and sells against some sort of common price mechanism. And there's just those two ways of handling things. Now in blockchain, we have ways of basically creating all sorts of things all the way along that spectrum, right? Different delegation and different amounts of decentralization along the way, because the entire process of decision making is taking place on a digital substrate, I'll use that word, which means that you can perform symbolic operations on every single aspect of policy, right? So you can create currencies to represent votes. You can find different ways of transacting those, deferring those, eliminating those, doubling those, doing anything you can imagine software code might do with that and represent things in a different way. Now, since we're already going past, is there an optimal or isn't there, and we're into example mode, you know, I actually like the liquid democracy model quite a bit, where everyone has individual votes for whatever topics. However, they can delegate these to people they trust. So you get lots of, you know, economics students delegating anything related to economics to their teacher, and that teacher delegating it to, I don't know, some minister of finance or some person that they respect. And finally, people who, you know, tend to delegate their votes to the experts. However, at any point in time, when those experts make unpopular decisions, they can find their votes are rescinded. Of course, that brings the whole concept of distributed liberty also into question, which is the majority always right? And there you go, right? The majority is not always right. Thank you, Brexit, and thank you, Trump, for that little lesson, right? Like, if the majority of people in Australia were to hate Jews and decide that they should all be killed, it wouldn't be the right thing to do, right? I mean, the Nazis had, I think, 10% of the vote, and they seemed to manage to overrule the majority in the way they instituted fascism very quickly. So in what situation is it right for the majority to be overruled, and in what situations is it wrong? These are sort of the issues that we are tackling when we try to find the right point, the optimal balance between those. And so far, we've got, it depends on the central authoritarian person. You know, I think I've just countered that with, it depends on the majority as well, right? And I think you have, you know, the delegative model that I just portrayed there actually has a lot of inherent risks in that all the votes potentially end up being delegated to experts. And while it might seem sensible that experts make all our decisions for us, experts tend to be highly educated individuals who may not fully grasp what life is like for the majority living in slums or in, you know, some other, right? The university bubble is a bubble and has necessarily a limited conception of some of the other issues. So I actually think that the optimal balance of these issues actually depends on the scale of the issue in question. So if you have a local issue, like what day should rubbish be picked up on our streets, then I think the optimal balance is that everyone in that local district should have their say about it, because everyone is quickly and easily able to assess the relevance of that decision to themselves because it impacts them directly. However, if we're talking about, you know, what color should the make way and, you know, no standing sign on Saturdays to Sundays, clear way on Friday afternoon between 4 and 5, what color should that road sign be? That's something that should be uniform to the entire state or even the entire country. And at that scale, I think the pendulum moves far more towards necessitating central authority as a natural center of power. In terms of the corruptibility of that power, it actually becomes a bit more of a relationship instead of either or, right? And it becomes that central authority has to be accountable to the distributed majority that then gets to say, okay, you've made a decision, but it wasn't actually in the best interests of the majority of people. Therefore, you need to be held accountable to the decisions you're making. And that is not necessarily always the case in today's economic system. All right, I think that's what we're going to get out of here. So here's an even wider question mark in terms of feedback loops. So we had a talk about feedback loops before, and I sort of started the discussion on the accountability part. So if you have a single authoritarian figure on any particular issue, right, you might not have a fascist dictator dictating everything on the state, but you might have a minister for the environment deciding which wildlife reserves to open up for logging, for instance. And how do you design feedback loops into platform governance to improve the balance between central authority and distributed freedom over time? So let's say you've got a new currency out there, right? And you've got a new blockchain system. Well, if we're going with the logging situation, then let's say we're managing the supply chain of the logging industry and making sure we know where wood comes from and where it goes, so we can get, sustainably, organically harvested pine for our neighbors in China or India or wherever we export it to. So how can feedback loops be designed into that system? Can anyone think of some feedback loops that might be placed into that system to warn us when it's out of balance, right? So if everyone gets to vote on every tree that gets cut down, right, one might say that's too far in the individual camp, and every individual might not care. And if they do care, they might just set either yes to every tree or no to every tree and, effectively pre-program all their votes, and then there's no purpose to the voting whatsoever. How might feedback loops be incorporated into such a system? Stunned silence.
Well, I have an idea.
Please.
I'm not sure if you would describe it in terms of feedback loop, but when I first heard about the concept of DAO stack, I'm not sure if this is their idea or if this is just an idea I got when I was sort of learning about them, but this idea that you would essentially have a market in which people, if they wanted to, they could kind of monitor the proposals that were coming up in terms of the central authority. And they could essentially just make bets on whether or not they thought the majority would really care, or they would basically they would look at a proposal and say, how do we think this is going to get voted on? Do we think the central authority is going to vote in a way that would be contrary to what the vote would actually be if it was distributed? And they would kind of make bets on it. And if there was a sort of disparity between what the outcome was going to be and what the apparent outcome was going to be and what the bets were, then that disparity would then actually trigger it to go to distributed democracy. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. That makes sense.
So these people would sort of be incentivized just in terms of money to be monitoring and to be trying to look for potential disparities. And obviously, if it's something that the central authority is going to vote on, which no one really cares about, then that disparity is not going to emerge. I'm not sure if that's what DAO Stack has in mind, or if this is...
No, it's very valid. So definitely sort of harnessing wisdom of the crowd, so to speak, with predictive voting markets works in multiple different ways, where people can predict reasonably accurately the expected success of, you know, an ICO or a decision or a vote and aspects like that. I've seen other proposals where tokens on any proposal or any project or any policy can be issued through a smart contract that basically will continuously issue that token against an increasing price. So you might be able to buy, you know, let's say, let's adopt this particular policy for half a cent if you're the first one in. So there's an incentive to be the first one in, but that price gradually increases. And ultimately what's happening is that the more people that buy into it, the higher that price goes and the bigger a fund is available to then execute that policy or implement that project. So then you get a market, even though there may be centralized entities behind it that actually then execute on the decision of that market, and you can balance it against these are the centralized decisions of the things we are going to do and we want to do, and then people can effectively vote against those if it's something that they care about. Yep.
How do those systems present against or protect against vocal minorities?
So very quickly, you do run the risk of $1, one vote, right? So the vocal minority can be a Bitcoin billionaire who just goes, meh, I want this. I'll throw 100 million at it and just take it away from anyone else in that market. And that's where you then have to shift from a store of value currency into something like a voting currency where literally the tokens are issued for votes, and everybody gets X number of votes, and everybody can put X number into any particular decision. So they can weight it according to the significance to them, but the vocal minority can, you know, the impact of someone to whom it cares a lot might be 5 coins instead of 1 coin, not 50 million coins.
So would that be a situation that each year people would get a finite number of coins for an election, so thus they would have to choose wisely?
Correct. Yeah. So it might be issued as a basic income, for instance, and you get 5 coins a week, and there's, you know, a couple of questions that come, or maybe 5 coins a month or whatever, and there's 1 or 2 questions that come out every month, depending on how engaged the population is with
what
these issues.
Passing something, because if you've got a community that isn't, you know, Australia, we have to go and vote, but in a situation here you're saying this has to be voluntary. What happens if only 20% of the people actually vote for something which in actual fact is not in the best interests of 50% of the people? Where's the protection there?
Yep. So that's a perfect example. Oh.
One way probably would be incentivizing the number of tokens generated every month for that person. If he contributes to a certain issue and participates to different issues, maybe they can provide more incentive to that person participating. That's just by way of like how it can.
So weighting, you can weight individual people's votes for according to how active they are in the network and how impacted
so that
they would
might
be.
increase their like number of voting tokens generated per month. Then by how active they are on different issues, they generate more tokens which they can add more to being participative in.
But that would be incentivizing a vocal minority, because they would be getting more.
That's exactly right.
More.
Yep.
All you're doing is amplifying the problem rather than trying to protect against it.
So you do have a risk there. You know, it's the same as every time you get that same feedback loop, right? Every time governments decide, like, we should figure out how to regulate banks, let's get all the heads of all the banks together to tell us how we should regulate the industry because they're the experts, right? On the one hand, it's very legitimate. They are the experts. They understand their industry better than someone in a government office just reading through legislation all day. Of course, at the same time, you know that the advice you're going to get is not going to be, deleterious to the banking industry anytime soon. And that's sort of what you get in those situations if you incentivize, if you weight people's votes higher for being involved in that particular issue. What you can acknowledge, though, is people's contribution to the platform, as a commons, their contribution to the commons, and therefore their stake in the commons as a representation of the overall percentage of stake that's voted, right? So you might only have 20% of people voting, but if 30% of the people haven't used the platform in 8 months, then potentially those 20% should be weighted more heavily because they are actually far more representative of the people that actually have a stake in the system. However, how do you define, right? That becomes the next question. How do you put feedback loops in to say the number of people that are voting has dropped too low and we need to rely more on a centralized authority for this, right? We need to rely more on some expert evaluation or some authoritarian trusted third party to make this decision because we only have 20% of people participating, and out of the 100% of people, we don't necessarily, since it seems to be the same 20% of people all the time, maybe we can't trust that their decisions actually reflect the interests of the 80% of people who can't be bothered to turn up.
Is that dangerous? How dangerous is that?
That's a good question. And how do you design a feedback loop to detect whether it's dangerous? I think one of the feedback loops is when you start having completely off the platform somewhere on Reddit, you start having the other 80% complain that all the decisions that have been made without them are not in their best interests. In which case, I would hope that those 80% would get back into the game and start voting, right? And then that should automatically address a lot of that issue. If it starts to upset people, then we've swung away from the minimizing harm portion.
There's a proxy system in place, and you could have the board, for example, being able to vote on behalf of the other 80% based on a constitutional mission statement.
But again, that system where you have a proxy is very easy to be
Manipulated,
and manipulated.
of course.
So any system whereby you can give away your vote that may have some intrinsic value to someone is easily corrupted.
And if there is no dollar value assigned to your vote, then anyone who will give you $1 for it, it might be corrupted. Now,
I mean, all you've got to do is have a look what was happening over in Thailand 2 coups ago, where you had people going up and paying 300 baht, which is $10,
yeah.
to farmers to go and vote a particular way. Their vote isn't worth anything to them themselves, but hey, you know what? I'm getting a day's pay to go and vote a particular way. That's great. I'm going to go and do it.
We can't influence the decision. We might as well get paid for it. And that's right. And you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place there because many things in life we don't do, or most things in life we don't do for economic reasons, right? So there are limits to economic incentives. There are limits to markets. So there have been examples of, like this one kindergarten where parents were late to pick up their kids afterwards. And they had a real issue because I think it was in Norway, Israel? Ah. So they had an issue because there's only so many teachers there, so many staff, and they're having to monitor all these kids sitting by the side of the road, and it's potentially dangerous, and they're not being paid, and like, you know, there's 2 inside, 3 out on the road, 2 more playing over by the playgrounds. They all want to go home, and they have to wait for the parents that usually turn up 10 minutes late, but sometimes 20 minutes, half an hour. So, okay, so they got, you know, some experts in who went, you know what, put a late fee on it. That'll show them. So they introduced a late fee, and what happened was that the amount of parents coming in late to pick up their kids went up 3-fold. Because before there was a late fee, parents just want to be good parents. They want to be seen as being responsible parents, you know, not just leaving their kids by the side of the road. They have an obligation to the teachers, those poor teachers who are taking care of their children. It's an honored sort of thing that they do. There's lots and lots of social obligations that no one's ever put down on paper in a contract. But, you know, if the other parents see that you're not picking up your kid and they see your kid by the side of the road, you don't want that kind of attention. But as soon as there's a late fee, it's like, oh, they've got an aftercare service. I'll just pay the money and I'll just finish what I'm doing, right? It becomes an economic transaction, and that actually eliminates a lot of those non-financial incentives. So there's dangers of just thinking we'll pay people for their votes to vote their way regardless, so that no one will outbid, right? Another option that's been used in the past, another sort of pebble to throw into the mix, is the idea of citizen juries, which is where particular situations come up and a random, you know, something like the jury on a court case, you have a random selection of participants from the population, and you go, here you go, here's $500 for your time, but you're going to spend the next 2 weeks really digging into this particular issue, right? We're going to look at, you know, the Murray Basin, and we're going to decide what to do with it. And here's 50,000 reports to read, and you can Google anything you like, you can talk to anyone you like, you can ask all the questions you need to, but the question at hand is, do we or don't we? And at the end of 2 weeks of figuring it out for yourself, you get to vote on it. And the theory behind it, and it's worked well in practice in places where it's tried in different ways. You know, in juries, it's still used regularly in our legal system because of this reason, which is mainly that people will generally perform that duty to the best of their ability for that limited time. They don't have enough time in that role, and they don't have enough responsibility over a long enough period of time to basically have the opportunity to be corrupted, right? So it's like, oh, this is a responsibility that I've been shouldered with for 2 weeks. It's an obligation and somewhat of an honor to represent the community in this. Yes, you know, there may need to be some controls in place to make sure everyone takes it seriously. And they get that opportunity to express their view on the best interests of the whole community for a particular occasion, for a particular decision. And after that, they return to being one of the masses, and the next time a decision comes up, it's a completely different random selection of people. So I think that is something that, takes out the vocal minority. You still have a minority of people making the decision, but they're making the best informed decision that they can, you hope. And you can make it more difficult to allow those people to be subjected to corruption and temptation by not disclosing the identities of these people until after the votes have been cast.
I mean, that would almost be a better system than what we have now, where people are making decisions with light of their next re-election.
Yeah.
It just removes that whole aspect.
Exactly. And also, there is, when each of these, and I'm just kind of opening up the box and not getting closer to a specific solution here, but there are big feedback systems between government, policy, the media, and culture, right? So government policy is framed by the media in such a way as to shift the cultural narrative. So, if you have a narrative of people on welfare are lazy tax cheats, and I don't want my taxes going to these lazy, single mothers or unemployed welfare mums, if that's the narrative, then culture gets created around this idea of meritocracy, the idea of everyone who's made it has made it because of their own hard work, and everyone who's failed has failed because of their own laziness. Right? There are no accidents of birth or circumstance. Then it becomes very easy to polarize like that. And even if you have enough wherewithal to maybe see the discussion in a different light, you can still start arguing of, whether this welfare mum is lazy or not, and not sort of actually ever tackle that there is a cultural narrative and a cultural bias. And as I said before, culture is itself very adaptive, right? Culture shifts and changes over time through some of these narratives that are pumped from the political sphere through the media, but also now increasingly from society to society, from culture to culture, where millions of people are spinning out memes now, little crystallized pieces of culture, if you will, that are just a snapshot that are very easily, sucked straight into the subconscious because they communicate very effectively and very efficiently. Although sometimes I have no idea what they mean, I'll be honest. But there's an increasing feedback loop there, so potentially a dilution of the impact of, media as the fourth estate, and an increase of the feedback loop within culture itself. Of course, we saw with Cambridge Analytica what can happen when the tools for that end up getting hijacked and used and abused, and the amount of power there is inherent with that. So as we look at governance, a big part of that is how communication is influenced and shaped, and who by, right? Who decides what's a relevant message to send to someone? Who decides what is spam? Who decides what is advertising? Who decides what is PR? Who decides what is fact? These are some of the big pieces. And so you get, every time there's a policy to be decided on, right, what are the criteria by which that evaluation has to be made? Who has to make the decision and evaluate by those criteria? And what are the criteria by which the policy, once implemented, will be evaluated as to being a success or failure? And is there a time or conditions upon which that can be rolled back? So another one of those feedback mechanisms can be, well, there was a single decision made by an authoritarian figure to do A or B, and within 2 months, there were millions of people rioting in the streets and burning down Parliament because they disagreed with the decision. Maybe we should look at repealing that decision, or at least, putting it to a $120 million plebiscite, right? As one feedback loop, and what's happening in that media narrative, and what's happening in sort of a other cultural narrative in the places like 4chan and Reddit and all that sort of places.
So would that be something like putting sunset clauses on legislation? So legislation is in place for so many years, and unless it's reinstated after that sunset clause, it goes away.
I think that would be a great idea. I think we have a huge number of laws on the books that have potentially passed their usefulness. And being able to evaluate that beforehand in terms of its effectiveness and the effective time. I think potentially, one way of doing it is saying, well, we have 1 year period in which to evaluate something. However, some legislation might not actually be relevant for another 15, 20 years, right? Like, how long does it take to validate the effectiveness or lack thereof of fluoridating water or something like that? It could be superannuation, yes. And some things you might, like superannuation, you might not want a sunset clause on, right? Like, if there are certain protections around your superannuation and you started paying it 50 years ago, you might be very upset if those sunset by themselves before you reach retirement age. So, yeah. So anyone else got any sort of ideas for feedback loops and the distinction and the balance between central authority and distributed freedom? Stunned silence. Everyone got it? Everyone ready to go out and design some systems now? Look, ultimately, I think what we're professing to be doing here in creating new currencies and new ways for people to get together and exchange value in an ecosystem comes with incredible responsibilities. So, before you just let the destructive urges flow and go, let's take down the banking system and let's take down the governments and let's do it all for ourselves. And I know none of you came in here screaming that, but there's definitely a libertarian streak in the hardcore Bitcoin maximalists. Let's actually have a look at what these systems have done right. And let's actually have a look at what it takes to figure out what is in everybody's best interest, right? What is the best way to maximize the well-being of all the participants? Because ultimately you're going to have some sort of a free market where people can choose to download any different type of blockchain they want. And they're going to have thousands upon thousands of coins, if not millions of coins to choose from, with which to conduct their business with different sorts of governance and different ability to influence the ways that those protocols develop over time. And setting something like that up, if you get it wrong, the project goes nowhere. If you get it right and it's popular, that's still not a guarantee that it's right. Right? There is still all the risk that everyone who's set up a system of government somewhere, right? I know Marx had some ideas about the fairest way to run governments, and he can't be blamed for, you know, the actions of Stalin and Mao and, you know, Putin today and all the bloodshed that happened in the name of communism, and also in the name of democracy and overthrowing communism, because of course you have, you know, a lot of history of a lot of blood being shed just off our shores, because hey, communism actually took hold, and what if the whole world went that way? And you know, I can't say I'm glad for the millions of lives lost, but I've certainly seen millions of lives lost under communist dictators as well, right? And it's very easy to get corruption when you centralize power. And therefore, the fundamental ideals under Bitcoin and most of the whole blockchain industry or ecosystem is very much one of striving for decentralization. And of course, we've sort of touched on the limits of decentralization in terms of, you know, there's a lot of decisions that I'm not interested in making myself. And being a voter comes with a certain responsibility, right? And sharing a commons, like the air, like water, and like a blockchain platform, comes with an obligation and a responsibility to the community that I'm a part of. And that in itself is a feature of culture. That's a cultural transformation and indoctrination, if you will, that everyone who downloads the app is aware of the obligations that they have to their community as a whole. Right. And how onerous do you want to make that obligation? Is it every week you're going to read all the suggested policy amendments, all the suggested rule changes, you're going to learn to code in a language that no one has ever before had to understand, because this particular system runs on a new language in and of itself, and you're going to have to understand the suggested changes to the algorithm, and you're going to have to make a decision based on the best interests of everyone, right? These, no thank you, right? I personally wouldn't go through that amount of effort just for a minor currency that is on the fringes of my life, right? If this is a network for transacting something major like houses, then I might be interested, but these are transactions that I don't make often enough to even actually put that much effort in on a regular basis. So what is the amount of input that can be expected from each individual? What is the amount of accountability, ownership, and obligation that can come with membership of a community that shares a common infrastructure like this? I'm just throwing out more questions here rather than answering them. But I'm hoping that all of you will toss and turn and think of all these solutions in your own heads tonight. Thanks. That was all.